This is a joint work together with Patrick de Koppel, my PhD student, and Ludovico Borato. And well, we all share sort of a background in multi-objective recommender systems, where what you usually want is to provide recommendations which does not only use the relevance, but also several other metrics like novelty, diversity, exploration, etc. Well, the problem is that there were tons of different metrics or objectives proposed for such a usage, but it was very rarely validated whether they actually measure what the user thinks those objectives represent. So it may be a problem that you're optimizing for something else that you should, but when you, for instance, want to empower the users with some level of control, you can actually jeopardize the very features you are aiming on, such as the trustworthiness or the transparency of the recommendations. So we wanted to do a little bit about it, and in particular, we focused on 3 research questions. First one was, how severe is actually the conceptual mismatch between what the user thinks some objective represents and how the system understands it. The second is, if we actually go to some particular metric, to what extent there is an operationalization mismatch, like how well the individual metric corresponds to the actual user perception, and whether if we have multiple options, there is some winner. And finally, how does the conceptual level mismatch affect the operational or metric level mismatch? So, in order to do so, we conducted an online user study focusing on the book and movie domains. And while the study itself was a bit broader, there were like 3 main parts relevant for this talk, which was the pre-study questionnaire, where we are asking on the concept level and concept level mismatch. Then we, based on some preference elicitation, provided personalized recommendations to the user. And after that, in another series of questionnaires, we were asking on the their perception of different objectives or the quality of the recommendations, and how do they comply with the metrics that are supposed to measure this. In the pre-study questionnaire, the users were exposed to several describing statements that may mean, for instance, what represents the novelty in their perspective, where one always matched with how the system understands it, and there were others that matched to a different criteria, for instance, diversity or exploration. Then, after the user gets through the preference elicitation phase, we provided them with a few series of recommending items, and after each such block, we actually asked them to evaluate the quality of the recommendations they just seen over, again, quite a few quality axes, where, for instance, for the novelty, we asked whether the recommended movies or books were mostly novel to that user, and the user can reply on a 6-point Likert scale. Well, as for the main results, more details, of course, are in the paper. We found out that although the users in most cases previously knew the objectives like exploration, diversity, or novelty, the concept level mismatch was actually quite high, especially for the exploration, which was very often confused with what we usually understand as diversity or novelty, but also diversity and novelty got quite a large share of users who understand it mostly as exploration. As for the metric level mismatch, in general, we saw that there is a certain level of correspondence with the correlation levels between usually 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, but quite often different metrics or the different basis for that metric seems to be the best at different data sets. For instance, here, if you are in the movie domains, the exploration defined on top of collaborative features seems to do the best job, while it really doesn't work well for the books domain. Moreover, when you're looking at the metrics, they quite often do as good job for equality they are actually not designed for. Such as here, we got interest diversity, which is actually pretty good corresponding with the novelty perception of the user. A bit better than the actual novelty metric. And also, we found out that if we separate the group of users who share the same concept level understanding of the metric from the ones who don't, the correspondence for quite a few metrics actually gets quite a bit higher. So there is sort of a nudge towards educating the users about what the system understands with some of those concepts if we want them to control it. So, I can give you a few takeaway messages. First would be if your solution is based on multiple objectives, especially if you want to allow the user some level of control, then you need to validate whether that particular operationalization corresponds to what the user thinks. Then there seems to be an added value in informing or educating users about how the system interprets those objectives. And especially if you're doing just the offline evaluation, try to avoid overstating of the small differences in mostly the beyond accuracy metrics that, quite frankly, is probably just a noise. All right, with that, I can conclude. Thanks for your attention. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. I just love metrics. First, so you went with trying to understand how users were perceiving those various metrics. But what about the expectation of what they wanted as a result, which is different, and so on? So I don't know whether you also had some information. It's like, okay, that's your definition of novelty, that's your definition of your perception, but actually when you actually want something, what do you expect?
Well, the other part of the study, which I did not talk about at all, was about the actual controlling mechanism for users to tune about those metrics, like how much they want the diversity in their next iteration of recommendations. There's an interesting insight we got from that, and this is that the users quite often hugely overestimate how much of the beyond accuracy they actually want. So they were like playing with sliders, and quite often what we saw that if they actually got way towards the beyond accuracy objectives, basically it doesn't matter which of those, they were in the end a bit unhappy. That probably goes to a better tuning of those mechanisms for the future. So I would probably say the users, at least at a short scale that we have, don't want as much beyond accuracy as they think.
You focus on how users perceive recommender systems objective, but in practice, platforms optimize often for business metrics like engagement or revenue. How should we reconcile situations where what users say they want diverges from what actually sustains the business?
That's a good question. I would probably go towards thinking about if the user is empowered to do this, why they are actually wanting that. It can be that they just want to play around, no problem with that. But maybe it means that the recommendations, as they are now, in one way or another, sucks. So that might be a nudge that, well, hey, maybe we should get a step back, because this can ultimately, in the long term, also affect our business metrics.
So some non-accuracy metrics are designed to represent the perspective of other stakeholders, such as the providers. How important is it that consumers understand those objectives the same way the providers do?
That's a good question. We actually did not venture to this direction yet. It's a great suggestion for the future work, though. No, I don't have the answer for that, but whoever was asking the question, I'd love to chat, so look me up after that.